quite a lot of cars made in the past 5 to 10 years or so, including my 2021 Kia Niro, have not come with a spare tyre of any kind, so not a full size or even a half size space saver spare tyre that you can only do 80 kilometers an hour with. They don't come with any spare tyre at all, and I can see the logic behind it. It takes up extra space carrying it around all the time, it adds extra weight to the car, and I guess it just costs more to initially put the spare tyre in there. And a lot of people these days aren't too interested in actually changing the tyre on the side of the road by themselves, seeing as we all have these things now that can very quickly and easily summon a professional to come and replace the tyre. There's really no massive need to carry a spare tyre around all the time. But the only time that sort of becomes an issue is if you venture beyond the city. I live on the sort of quite outskirts of Melbourne, so most of the time I'm fine, but I do fairly often go on longer drives quite further out of the city in more remote places where there's often very patchy phone reception. So if something happened to one of my tyres when I'm out doing that, then it might be harder to call for help because there might not even be enough phone reception to make a call at all, and I'd be walking around waving my phone in the air or something. And even if I do have good enough reception and I'm able to call for help, it could mean I'm sitting on the side of the road with the car for quite a while, waiting for some tow truck or something to eventually come from the nearest town or something. So once you leave normal city or suburban areas, it does become more convenient to have a spare tyre with you just in case anything happens. So as I said before, my Kia Niro did not come with a spare tyre, and I'm not sure if any Kia Niros even do come with a spare tyre, but I decided it would be a good idea to have one, so I went to buy one. And at the time I was doing this, which was about a year ago now, it was actually kind of hard to find a spare tyre to buy that would fit in my Kia Niro. I didn't even need a full-sized one. I thought that wasn't quite necessary. Even just having a half-sized one that can only do 80 kilometers an hour would at least be enough to get me off the side of the road at that point and get me to somewhere else to buy a new tyre and have it professionally restored. But as I said, I was sort of struggling to find a spare tyre of any kind that would fit my car. And as I was researching, I even came across a few forums where people were saying you weren't really meant to change the tyre of a fully electric Kia Niro by yourself because the battery's under the car and the jack could easily slip and puncture the battery, and then it's basically game over for the car. But I had a look down under my car at the jacking point and the distance between that and the battery, and I thought, it seems pretty unlikely a jack would slip and puncture the battery, so I want to go ahead and get a spare tyre anyway. That way, if something does happen to one of my tyres and I need to change the tyre, maybe I weigh up the options, but at least by having a spare tyre, I can make the choice then whether or not it's worth the risk to just change it myself and hope I don't damage the battery at all. So I wanted to buy a spare tyre, and I did find a fairly suitable looking spare tyre for a Kia Niro on a website called kiastuff.com, and that seemed pretty good. It was for a car several years newer than mine, but I figured it would probably be fine. The wheels are probably pretty much the same size, so I thought that would be good. But it is an American website, and when I tried to order one, it turns out they don't ship to Australia at all. So that was sort of a dead end there. So I kept looking, and eventually I ended up on eBay, where I found a used spare tyre from a Hyundai Tucson that had a car crash in America, and the tyre had never been used. It'd just been sitting in someone's boot for several years, and I imagine the car eventually got into some sort of crash or something and it was written off, so they sold off the spare tyre. So my car's obviously not a Hyundai Tucson, but based on some of the research I did at the time, it looked like all the sort of connections were going to line up. So it's basically the same spare tyre for either a Kia Niro or a Hyundai Tucson. So it didn't really matter, that tyre should fit. And it ended up costing $150 US to buy the tyre. and then another 140 something US dollars to get it shipped over here. So it was almost the entire cost of the tyre again in shipping. But now I have a space saver spare tyre for my Kia Niro. So now all that was left to do was to get a suitable jack for it and one of whatever these things are called to undo the nuts, and I'm pretty much good to go. All I need to do is find somewhere to store it inside the car so that I have it if I ever need it. And that should be pretty simple. In fact, if we open up the boot and lift up the floor that's inside the boot and take that out completely, just to get it out of the way, there's a foam insert in the bottom here, which you can just unscrew with one big screw eventually. And then that just lifts out here. And that has an air compressor and goo to block up a minor puncture in a tyre and other tools like that. But you can take that out, and then what you're left with is this big roundish hole underneath the boot that looks pretty perfect for a spare tyre. But there's only one problem. And that is, it doesn't quite fit. So that makes me a little bit concerned that maybe this spare tyre is not the right shape or size or something for my car and isn't meant to fit on it at all. So I'm slightly worried about that. But also maybe this spot down here was just never intended for a spare tyre. Maybe it's only meant for this foam tray thing to go in, which is a bit different to a spare tyre. Or maybe the car's meant to have just a thinner spare tyre, even though this is still thinner than the real wheels. Maybe it was meant to have a thinner spare tyre or something. Or maybe even when I put the tyre on the car, it'll squash down a bit from the weight or something. So I'm sort of telling myself a bunch of different things to say, this tyre will still work, but I'm not entirely sure. But anyway, the point is, it doesn't quite fit in the boot like this. I have tried just putting the floor straight on, but then the floor's just sitting on the tyre, not actually anything else. So the corners all, not sure if you can see that, but the corners all go down. When you push on the corners or sit anything on the corners, they all sort of flop down below it. So that's not really good enough. I did try putting bubble wrap under each corner, but as you can imagine, that didn't work for multiple reasons. So that was a bit of an issue. So what I ended up doing is I built this big wooden frame out of just scrap wood really, and then I sat this inside the boot very carefully so that it sits over the tyre like this. And I put these just old scraps of carpet I found around under it and everything so that it wouldn't rattle or anything as I'm driving, wouldn't rub on anything, wouldn't scratch anything, and then that's all good. There's now a fairly stable base for the floor to go back on. But when you try to put the floor back on, it doesn't really fit because there's curves and everything, angles on the seat and everything, and the floor's now going significantly higher than it was originally intended to. So the floor's the wrong shape. I could maybe sort of cut this, but it is still a bit of a flimsy floor anyway. And if I ever sell the car, I probably want to keep this intact. So what I did was ditch this entirely. And then I got this big solid piece of wood here, big flat board, and fairly painstakingly cut and sanded and jigsawed and sanded again until it was finally about the right shape to fit in this oddly shaped boot. Well, I guess all boots are fairly oddly shaped, but it wasn't a square or anything, so that took a while. But then I used the staple gun to put some more carpet all over it. And now this platform can slide into the boot like so. And now I have a very stable platform on the boot that I can put whatever I want on. It's a boot. And underneath that, I have plenty of space for not only the tyre, but the jack and other little tools and air compressor and glue and spare charging cables, really anything else that I might want to have in the back of the car all the time in case I ever need it. And as an added bonus, this is kind of better than the boot used to be. I did sacrifice a little bit of vertical space for it, but I don't really need all that much boot space, so that's not a big deal. But I now have a more solid platform than I did, and this very plush residential sort of carpet being in the boot instead of the traditional car carpet has actually been really good. You can sit things on here and the plushness really helps to not let things slide around as much while driving. So that's really good. And I also actually deliberately made it a bit taller than it needed to be to fit the tyre in, so that the platform would actually be fairly level with the opening of the boot here, which sort of makes it easier for getting heavy things in and out sometimes. And also, if I go and fold down the back seats, because of the raised height of this platform here, I now have a pretty much flat floor that goes all the way through the back here, which is nice to be able to lie things flat. So, in the end, I think it all worked out very well being able to add a spare tyre. It was a little difficult to get it at first, and I had to do a bit of DIYing, and I am slightly concerned about ever actually putting the tyre onto the car, if I ever need to. And apparently, as I found out in some of the research, the half-size spare tyres, which I have, apparently don't fit on the front wheels because of the brake calipers or something. So if something happens to a front tyre, you have to take the front tyre off, put a back tyre on the front wheel, and then put the spare on the back. So it's still not perfect and slightly scary if something ever happens, but at least I now know I do have a spare tyre that I could do something with if I ever needed to. And as much as I lost a little bit of boot space and it now looks a little bit homemade, the boot actually ended up being better. I now have some better features than the car originally had. So I think that's pretty good. But that's it for this video. Maybe you'll watch another one in the future. And if you do, I'll see you then.